Chapter 5. A Sinful Appetite. Cerberus closed his eyes and braced himself for a tremendous fall. But rather than experiencing the sensation of falling through the air, the prince felt a strong grip on his wrist, preventing him from plunging to the depths below. He looked up and saw Aedril struggling with every ounce of his strength to pull the prince to safety. The commander had finished his battle with the monstrous hound just in time to witness Cerberus's plight. The prince expressed great relief as Aedril pulled him back onto the bridge. "That was close," Cerberus gasped. "Are you all right?" Aedril asked. "Yes, I am fine," Cerberus replied. "How about you?" he asked, noticing that the commander's right sleeve had been ripped to shreds. "I will live," Aedril said, calmly dismissing the ugly wound. "There is something very evil afoot here. We must hurry back to the others right away. Those hellhounds were protecting something other than corpses back there, and I want to find out what it is." The knights made their way back to the mansion, where Lorien and Fendale were still sound asleep. Despite their best efforts, they could not manage to wake the drugged warriors. It was not until later in the afternoon that the effects of the sedative wore off. The knights were slightly groggy, but other than that, they were fine. Cerberus and Aedril took turns describing the account of what had turned out to be a very adventurous and revealing day for them. When the commander informed them of what he had read on the empty sarcophagus, the knights expressed their shock and disbelief. Could it be that Demetrius somehow cheated death? Fendale asked. "Impossible," Lorien scoffed. "This is obviously a different person. The king's body was probably the victim of looters." "I doubt a looter could have made it into the city, let alone the royal sepulchre," Aedril said. "I will grant you, the missing corpse is a most unusual circumstance," Eberhard said. "But I think that it is a tremendous leap of reasoning to conclude that Demetrius and the missing king are one and the same. How many children and old people did you see last night?" Aedril asked the knight. "How many people did you see with visible flaws, or that were anything less than beautiful?" "None," Eberhard replied evenly. "And how many people like that do you suppose Cerberus and I saw today?" The commander continued. "None," Eberhard guessed, though he knew Aedril would confirm it as true. "Indeed, we saw no people at all," Aedril said, "not even the works of perfection that greeted us last night." "I saw them head north to the palace before dawn," Cerberus interjected. "When Aedril and I searched the castle, we found no sign of anyone. Indeed, the only two places in this city that display any sign of a sustained human presence are this mansion and the royal sepulchre, of all places." "Perhaps you are overlooking the obvious," Lorien suggested. "Maybe they abandoned this city altogether after they cut off contact with the outside world. Perhaps they all dwell in the valley below and come here only on the rare occasion to greet visitors to their land. Maybe instead of searching in tombs, we should be looking for a path that leads down into the valley." "Your explanation would be a perfectly plausible one, if not for the many unusual things we already know about our hosts," Aedril said. "Why did they drug our food? Why is no one here to speak with us at this moment? And why did they refuse to immediately lead us to Errol? I, for one, do not think the answers to these questions lie in the valley below. My belief is that they will only be found in the tomb of the kings." Aedril led the way to the royal palace and then down to the mausoleum. They crossed the bridge where Cerberus and Aedril had fought with the guardians of the tomb of the kings. Blood stained the rampart where the commander had struggled for his life against the fierce hellhound. The warriors passed under the archway once more and again entered the cheerless halls where the bodies of monarchs centuries old rotted to dust, all except for one, that was. The sarcophagus of King Demetrius was wide open, the result of either a highly disrespectful act of vandalism or a far darker reason. Aedril walked in the direction from where the savage guardians had charged out earlier. He found a narrow staircase. The stairs led down into the darkness, seemingly for a great distance. Aedril and Cerberus held torches as they led the way down the stone steps. The staircase was not as long as it had first appeared to be, and the knights soon found themselves standing in a rather large tunnel. After venturing several yards into the murky corridor, the knights heard a noise that was terrifyingly familiar to Cerebos and Iedril. The wild barking of the ferocious hellhounds echoed throughout the darkened hall. The knights drew their swords as the beasts charged out of the darkness toward them. "Thorgol, Diabus, yield," a voice ordered from the shadows. The knights immediately recognized the master of the beasts. "Demetrius," Fendale exclaimed. "You sound so surprised," the Palacadian spoke. "Surely my presence does not come as a shock to you. After all, you came here looking for me, did you not?" "What is going on here, Demetrius?" Iedril asked. "Where is Errol?" "All your questions will be answered if you will just follow me," Demetrius said, as he turned to head back down the hall. The monstrous dogs growled menacingly as the warriors walked past them. The dark tunnel led to an enormous cave. It was there that the mystery of the missing Palacadians was revealed. "So, this is where everyone has been hiding," Cerebus observed as he looked into the crowded cavern. The cave seemed to have been converted into one huge bedroom, where apparently the entire population of Palacade went to rest. The white-robed citizens were casually reclined on the soft pillows and linens that covered the stone floor of the cavern. The uproar of the watchdogs had awakened them from their slumber. "We are not hiding," Demetrius said. "This is our home. But you have an entire city full of buildings in which to dwell," Fendel noted. "We prefer the cave," the Palacadian said. "It is much cozier, do you not think?" A wave of uneasiness swept over the knights as they felt the stares of the cavern dwellers upon them. There was a hungry look in their eyes, as if they were harboring a sinful appetite. "You wanted to see your friend? Well, there he is," Demetrius said as he pointed to the far end of the cavern. There, on the broad, pillow-covered steps, sat Prince Errol. Lounging beside him was the ravishing lady in white. The knights made their way through the reposed throng of onlookers to the place where Errol looked to be comfortably resting. "I am glad to see you again," Cerebus said as he approached his brother. "How are you? They have not harmed you, have they?" "I should say not," the dark-haired beauty beside the prince scoffed, obviously offended by Cerebus's words. Her dark eyes gave off an evil glare as she looked over the visitors. "Honored guests, I would like to introduce you to my lovely sister, Andorra," Demetrius said proudly. "Such a tasty-looking bunch," Andorra said with a wicked laugh. "What does she mean by that?" Lorien asked nervously. Iedril could see that the situation was growing more bizarre by the minute and wished to leave before things got any stranger. "Come on, Errol, we are leaving," he said. He then turned to his Palacadian host and managed some hollow words of gratitude. "Thank you for your hospitality, Demetrius. It certainly has been a most interesting experience. But if you will excuse us, we must be going now." "I am not going," Errol protested. "Do not be ridiculous. Of course you are going," Cerebus said firmly. The prince stepped toward his brother, but Demetrius stood in his way. "Errol is staying, and so are you," the Palacadian said as his kind complexion turned into a dark scowl. The white-robed hosts of the cavern stood up and closed in on the knights. Their warm and cheerful expressions were now twisted into sinister grins. "What have you done to Errol?" Cerebus shouted. "If you harm him in any way, I will." "You need not worry about Errol," Andorra said, as she ran her red nails gently down the side of the young prince's face. "I have chosen him to be my husband. The rest of you have been selected to be the main course at our wedding feast." All at once, the dispositions of the Palacadians changed. Their graceful features suddenly grew savage and bestial. Their eyes glowed red, like flames, and their portentous grins were pulled back into fierce snarls, revealing a prominent pair of razor-sharp fangs. Cerebus drew his sword and drove it into Demetrius's abdomen. The Palacadian laughed wickedly as the prince withdrew his bloody blade. "You fool," Demetrius mocked the prince. "You cannot kill a vampire with a sword." Andorra lunged at Cerebus, eager to quench her wicked thirst. But her monstrous expression turned to one of pure agony as she clutched at the wooden shaft that had found its way to her heart. Cerebus looked back and saw Iedril reloading his bow. The wounded vampire fell to her knees and cried out in pain as centuries of life fled her body. The arrow had proved to be a more than adequate substitute for the legendary vampire's bane, the wooden stake. However, the number of bloodthirsty Palacadians greatly surpassed the supply of arrows the knights had with them. But if the warriors had anything to their advantage, it was the sudden confusion left in the wake of Andora's demise. Cerberus took advantage of the chaos as he grabbed Errol and bolted for the tunnel leading out of the cavern. Fendale and Lorien followed the fleeing prince, along with Eberhard. Fendale looked over his shoulder to see where Eadril was, but all he saw was a sea of snarling pale faces. The knight's heart sank as he realized that the commander had no hope of escaping. Fendale and the others managed to make it safely out of the cave. However, the path to the staircase was blocked. Thorgol and Diabus stood before the steps, all four of their monstrous heads staring menacingly at the warriors. "And where do you think you are going?" A voice from behind them growled. The warriors turned around and looked in horror as Demetrius stepped out from the shadows, his face bearing an expression every bit as ferocious as those of the hellhounds. The vampire lunged at Cerberus. At the same time, the hellhounds charged at the other knights. Eberhard drove his sword into the flesh between Thorgol's two heads. The beast let out a pair of simultaneous yelps and fell limply to the ground. Meanwhile, Lorien slashed one of Diabus's throats, releasing a bright red torrent of blood. The beast's second head continued to snap at Fendale until it too was finally silenced. As the hounds were being killed, Cerberus and Demetrius continued to struggle with each other. With a spurt of superhuman strength, the vampire slammed Cerberus against the stone wall of the corridor. Demetrius opened his mouth and prepared to sink his dagger-like fangs into the soft flesh of Cerberus's throat. Errol, now free from Andora's spell, struck Demetrius across the back with his sword. The vampire snapped his head in Errol's direction and let out a hate-filled snarl. The prince stood motionless with fear as the ghoul turned to attack him. Cerberus immediately took advantage of this diversion and shoved Demetrius into the opposite wall of the tunnel. "Run!" Cerberus screamed at Errol. The young prince did not move. He was paralyzed with fear. Cerberus ran toward Errol and grabbed his wrist. "Move," he commanded as he dragged the younger prince up the stairs. The other knights had already made their way to the bridge. Cerberus and Errol raced side by side through the tomb in the direction of the exit. But with the safety of the sunlight only a few feet away, Errol tripped and fell on his face. Cerberus quickly grabbed his brother and pulled him forward. However, another force suddenly pulled the prince in the opposite direction. Errol's eyes widened in terror as he looked back and saw Demetrius's monstrous face. The ghoul's sickly white hand was grasped tightly around Errol's ankle. The prince suddenly found himself to be a human rope in a tug of war between Cerberus and Demetrius. Much to his alarm, the vampire was winning. His torso, which had been basking in the late afternoon sunlight, was now in the cool shadows of the mountain corridor. But the complexion of the struggle suddenly changed as Lorien came forward to help Cerberus pull the prince. Errol could feel the warm sunlight on his head and back once more. The change in position was not without a price, however. Errol felt as though he was being torn apart at the joints. The pain was almost unbearable. Then with a mighty surge, Cerberus and Lorien pulled the prince toward them. Errol's body was pulled completely out into the sunlight, along with Demetrius's hand and forearm. The ghoul's pale flesh burst into flames as the sunlight struck it. The vampire screamed in agony as he pulled his burning arm back into the shadows. The warriors wasted no time as they crossed the bridge. It was not until they reached the castle that Eadril's plight was given consideration. "Where is Eadril?" Errol asked. "He got cut off from us as we were escaping," Fendel said sadly. "When I looked back, I could not even see him amid all of the vampires." "We must go back for him," Errol demanded. The thought of his friend being torn apart by the vicious mob of ghouls prompted Errol to turn back toward the tomb. Cerberus stopped his brother in his tracks. "Listen, we are all concerned about Eadril, but we cannot go back in there," Cerberus said. "It is far too dangerous. Besides, why do you think he hesitated when we took flight? He was buying time for us, so that we might escape. The sun is creeping low in the west. We do not have much daylight left. When the sun sets, they will come after us in full force. We must put as much space between us and them in what little time we have. It was with great reluctance that the warriors left Eadril behind. With the setting sun as a backdrop, the knights sprinted down the empty streets of the city. The daylight was their most powerful weapon against the vampires, but they had no control over it. In less than an hour's time, darkness would fall. And darkness was what the vampires loved best, save for the precious blood that raced through the warriors' veins. Upon reaching the mansion, where they had spent the night, Cerebus stopped. "What are you doing?" Lorien asked. "There is a maiden in here," the prince explained. "I must warn her about the danger. Go on without me. I will catch up to you." "Do not waste your time on her," Errol said. "She is probably one of them." "No, she is not," Cerebus insisted. "She is one of us. I will not let her fall victim to their unholy appetite." "There is no time for further argument." "I will go with you then," Errol said. "No," Cerebus protested. "There is no sense in all of us risking our lives. Do not worry. I will be with you shortly. Now go." Cerebus ran into the mansion. Despite his brother's orders, Errol took a step toward the building. Lorien placed a hand on the young prince's shoulder. "You heard him," Lorien said. "Let us be on our way. We are wasting precious light." The young prince led the others over the stone bridge and into the mountain corridor on the other side. By the time they reached the path between the cliffs, the last of the light was bleeding from the sky. As the dark shadow of night passed over the land, Errol prayed that somehow they would be spared from the vampire's wrath. All hope left Errol as a fierce cold wind blew at his back from out of the north. The chase was on. Errol could feel the vampires closing in on them. Soon he could hear them. The horrid cries of the undead citizens of Palisade nearly turned the knights to stone. Though his heart begged him not to, Errol looked up behind him. The sky was filled with the white-robed night flyers. The pale folds of their garments flowed in the cold wind as their silhouettes loomed frightfully in the moonlight. They were still a good distance off, but they were closing in ever so quickly. The knights' brows were soaked with sweat as they charged through the chasm. They had long since passed the normal physical capabilities of their bodies. It was fear that kept them on their furious pace. If they could just make it past the gates of Palisade, Errol thought that maybe they would be safe. He had to look back once again to see how much time they had. It took all the courage he could summon to look upon the ghouls yet another time. He knew they were close, for he could hear their wicked laughter growing louder. But it was not until he looked back that he realized just how close they were. "How many arrows do you have left?" Errol asked Lorien, his voice panting from exhaustion and fear. "4, the knight replied. "I have 5, Fandel said. "And I have 2. The voice was that of Eadril. The knights all gazed in shock as the commander approached them. Errol stepped forward to embrace his friend, but hesitated as a look of doubt fell over his face. "Do not worry," Eadril said. "They did not turn me into one of them." "But how did you escape?" Lorien asked. "I held them at bay with a torch and made my way out," Eadril explained. "But there is no time for further discussion, for they are upon us." The knights all turned and looked in horror as the red-eyed fiends came screaming down from above. Overcome by panic, the warriors scrambled to ready their bows. With the hideous cries of the ghouls drumming in their ears, the knights fired their arrows into the shadows above them. Blood-curdling screams of agony pierced the air as 2 of the ghouls fell from the ranks of the undead into the merely dead. Errol's aim betrayed him. He struggled to reload his bow as the vampire he had failed to hit came bearing down on him. Clumsy with fear, the prince fumbled the feathery shaft as he tried to place it along the bowstring. His lack of composure was costly, as the vampire knocked him to the ground and clawed at him fiercely, all the while attempting to sink her fangs into the soft flesh of his neck. Errol, struggling for his life, clamped onto the fiend's neck and rolled over to gain the advantage. In his right hand, he still held the arrow that he had been so desperately trying to load. His alert mind thought of a new use for the weapon. Clutching the wooden shaft tightly in his hand, he drove it deep into the ghoul's chest. However, he could not relish his moment of triumph for long, as the skies above him were filled with the baleful wails of the Palacadians. The warriors were running out of hope, as well as ammunition. They could not shoot as fast as the vampires were coming at them. The flames of hope within the hearts of the knights were reduced to dying embers as they faced the remainder of the vampire horde, with no arrows remaining. The complexion of the battle suddenly changed as a new noise was heard over the wicked screams of the ghouls. For all the knights, except for Errol, the battle cry was all too familiar. As if their predicament was not bad enough, the knights had yet another enemy to deal with. The ominous forms of the gargoyles joined the white-robed Palacadians in the black sky above the chasm. It seemed the winged beasts had come to join in on the slaughter of the doomed warriors. Or had they? The knights watched the sky above them in amazement as the gargoyles appeared to be attacking the Palacadians. Centuries of resentment were unleashed as the winged beasts released their wrath upon the remnants of the nation that had driven them from their mountain home in a bloody war many years ago. The fierce battle in the sky suddenly left the knights unnoticed. "Hurry, let us get out of here before the winner of that battle turns its attention back on us," the Aedril said. The knights resumed their exodus as a war between the two ancient enemies was waged in the sky. The cries of the ghouls and the screeches of the gargoyles slowly faded into the distance as the warriors entered the mountain corridor leading to the outside world. Errol feared that at any moment he would hear the awful shrieks of the vampires close in on them once again, but such was not the case. The knights managed to make it to the gates of Palacade without incident, and apparently without the vampires at their heels. Despite having officially left the realm of the undead, the warriors felt no safer. They did not once break a stride in their furious pace. Errol saw no reason why the ghouls would end the chase at the gates. After all, it was in Palace that Errol first saw the wicked Andorra. The elven prince would not feel safe until he reached Vilan, where he would have an army of allies to help him. Much to their relief, the warriors did not have to continue their journey on foot, as they found their horses grazing in the field near the mountain gate. The knights spurred the steeds on at breakneck speed down the road to Palace. They stopped in the small village only long enough to pay the innkeeper and leave a message for Cerebus in the bleak hope that he would make it out of Palacade alive. Having accomplished that, the knights resumed their ride beneath the clear night sky on the road to Vilan, eager to put as much distance as they could between the Palacadians and themselves.